Why do men call you cold, even though you've only stopped explaining yourself? Sit with that question for a moment. You answered clearly. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't withdraw affection. You simply stopped offering the long explanation. You stopped translating every feeling into language he could receive without effort. And somehow, within a few days, the word cold appeared, or different, or you've changed. A quiet doubt usually follows. Maybe I was too direct. Maybe I should have softened it. Maybe the version of me that keeps explaining is the one that keeps the connection safe. There is nothing wrong with you for feeling that doubt. Most women your age have been trained, over decades, to treat a man's discomfort as a signal that they need to adjust. So when the explaining stops and his tone shifts, the first place the mind goes is self-correction. But the shift you are feeling is not evidence that you became cold. It is evidence that you stopped doing a particular kind of work he had come to rely on without ever naming it. I want to tell you about Margaret. Margaret is 61. She had been divorced for 4 years when she began seeing a man of 63. He was steady, decent, the kind of man who already knew how to live quietly. For the first 8 months, she did what many women in our generation still do almost automatically. Whenever she sensed a slight distance or a small irritation in his voice, she explained. She explained why she needed a quiet weekend. She explained why a particular comment had landed hard. She explained so that he would understand, and so the space between them would not stay open long enough to become uncomfortable. One evening, after a brief exchange that left a mild tension in the air, she simply answered in one clear sentence. No further translation, no softening paragraph, no attempt to bring him back to ease right away. His reaction was not anger. It was a quieter thing, a withdrawal so subtle she almost missed it at first. A few days later, he told her she seemed different. Margaret spent the next week wondering whether she had damaged something good by refusing to do what she had always done. What happened inside him is the part most conversations never reach. Many men over 55 have lived for decades inside an unspoken emotional contract. In that contract, the woman performs a steady, nearly invisible labor. She translates. She takes her own internal experience and converts it into a version he can receive, without having to stretch very far. She softens the edges of her needs. She closes the emotional gaps before they ask anything of him. She makes herself legible in real time so he never has to sit for long in unresolved space. This labor is rarely dramatic. It does not look like overgiving in the obvious sense. It looks like care. It looks like emotional intelligence. It looks like the thing a mature woman does to keep a relationship from cooling. And because it has been present for so many years, in long marriages, in second relationships, in the quiet habits of daily life, most men stop noticing it as labor at all. It becomes part of the atmosphere, something that is simply there, like background temperature. When that temperature changes, when the translation stops, the first experience inside him is rarely desire or deeper interest. It is a low-grade disorientation. A sense that something reliable has been removed, and he does not yet have language for what is missing. The easiest story available to him is that she has become colder, more distant, less invested. That story protects him from having to notice the actual loss. The loss of a form of emotional regulation he never had to build for himself. At this age, the pattern runs deep. Many of these men spent 20 or 30 years in relationships where the woman quietly managed the emotional climate. They were never required to develop the muscle of sitting with a woman's unfiltered experience and finding their own way through it. So when they finally meet a woman who no longer performs that service, the absence registers as rejection rather than clarity. The confusion you feel when he calls you cold is understandable. But it is not proof that your clarity is the problem. It is proof that he is encountering, perhaps for the first time in a long while, a version of you that is no longer managing his comfort in real time, and that encounter is rarely comfortable for him. That discomfort does not always announce itself as irritation. Sometimes it appears as a sudden need for space. Sometimes it shows up as a subtle flatness in his responses. Sometimes it simply becomes a quieter version of the man you thought you were getting to know. What is rarely visible from the outside is the internal calculation taking place. Part of him registers the clarity. He may even respect it. At this stage of life, many men have grown tired of chaos and emotional volatility. A woman who can state something once and leave it there can feel like a relief. Yet another part of him feels the loss of something he never consciously requested but had come to depend on. The translation work she used to do created a kind of emotional buffering. It allowed him to remain relatively still while the relational atmosphere was managed around him. When that buffering disappears, he is left to feel the temperature of the room without anyone adjusting it first. This is the point where the misreading becomes almost inevitable. Because he has no ready language for "I am missing the free emotional labor I used to receive," the mind reaches for the nearest available explanation. She is less warm, she is pulling away, she is no longer as invested. The explanation is inaccurate, but it is functional. It protects him from having to examine the more uncomfortable possibility that a significant portion of the ease he felt in the relationship was being quietly produced by her. Consider how long this pattern has usually been in place. For many men over 55, the women who shared their earlier decades, whether a first wife, a long-term partner, or even a series of relationships, often performed this same quiet service. Not because they were weak, and not because they were instructed to do so in any formal way, but because it was the relational weather they grew up inside. Over time, the man stops experiencing it as something being given. It simply becomes the condition under which connection feels normal. When a later woman declines to continue the pattern, the change feels personal even when it is not. There is a particular tension that arises inside him at that moment. One part of him recognizes that a woman who no longer translates herself on demand is a woman with a center of her own. That recognition can carry a quiet form of respect. Another part experiences the absence of the old buffering as a mild threat. Not a threat of abandonment in the dramatic sense, but a threat to the familiar arrangement in which his own emotional range was rarely stretched. The second part often speaks louder, at least at first. It is the part that reaches for the word cold. This is why the accusation can land with such force. It is not simply a description of her behavior. It is an attempt to restore the previous emotional climate by making her responsible for the discomfort the new climate has created. If she can be persuaded that clarity equals coldness, there is a chance she will resume the translation work. Many women, hearing the word, feel the old training activate and begin explaining again, longer, softer, more carefully, in an effort to prove they have not become difficult. Yet the deeper truth is simpler and less flattering to either party. The discomfort he feels is largely the discomfort of having to meet a woman who is no longer editing herself in real time for his ease. That meeting requires a capacity many men this age have never been required to develop. Some will stretch toward it. Others will quietly retreat toward relationships that still offer the old arrangement. Both responses reveal more about his internal architecture than about her worth. You are not too much for wanting to stop the automatic translating. You have never been too much for wanting your own experience to remain intact instead of constantly converted into something easier for someone else to hold. The years of being told, directly or indirectly, that your depth or your directness made you difficult do not make the accusation true now. They only make the doubt arrive faster. What actually changes when the translation stops is not primarily how much he wants you. What changes is the accuracy of the picture he is able to form of you. As long as you keep converting your internal world into a more digestible form, he is relating to an edited version. When the editing ends, he is left with the unfiltered presence of a woman who has her own center. Some men experience that presence as grounding. Others experience it as exposure. The exposure is of their own limited range, not of any deficiency in her. This is the part that rarely gets spoken. The boundary of no longer explaining is not a strategy designed to increase his interest. It is simply the decision to stop performing a form of labor that was never fully mutual. When that decision is held consistently, without the secret hope that it will produce a particular response in him, something quieter becomes possible. You stop measuring the success of your clarity by whether he stays comfortable. You begin measuring it by whether you remain clear. And in that shift, the old doubt loses some of its power. You no longer need to rush in with a longer explanation to repair the feeling that you have become cold. You can let the misreading belong to him. You can notice that his discomfort is information about the contract he was living inside, not a verdict on the woman you have become. The peace that follows is not dramatic. It is simply the absence of the constant low-level effort to keep someone else's emotional weather stable. That absence is what many women your age have been quietly craving for years, even when they could not yet name it. If you have ever stopped explaining yourself and watched the word cold or different appear shortly afterward, I would be interested to know what you noticed in the days that followed, both in him and in yourself. The real stories often contain more truth than any general observation.